Three U.S. presidents, John F. Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, and James A. Garfield, were all tragically assassinated, their deaths marking pivotal moments in American history. But what if the stories we've been told were lies? What if these weren't the acts of lone gunmen, but meticulously orchestrated murders by shadowy figures, desperate to maintain control over the nation? Hidden documents, long buried in the depths of history, reveal a dark conspiracy, one involving powerful elites, secret societies, and a game of power that the public has never fully understood. The truth behind their assassinations has been kept under wraps for decades. But now the shocking revelations are about to surface, threatening to expose the untold secrets of American politics. As the years passed, the world moved on, but the shadows of Kennedy, Lincoln, and Garfield's deaths remained etched into the fabric of American history. A veil of secrecy continued to shield the truth, and the events surrounding their untimely deaths became more than just historical incidents. They became part of a larger, darker narrative. This was a tale not of isolated assassinations, but of a complex web of conspiracies woven by those who feared the reformist ideals of these leaders. The more one searched for the truth, the deeper the mystery grew. It wasn't until years after the deaths of these presidents that cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade. Decades after the murder of John F. Kennedy, a group of investigative journalists, tirelessly uncovering the unsolved puzzle of the assassination, stumbled upon something odd. Old, discarded documents, formerly classified, surfaced through various channels: fragmented reports, obscure notes in the margins, and declassified intelligence briefs. They all pointed to a consistent pattern: hidden factions with murky affiliations, each playing their own hand in shaping history. The conspiracy, as it seemed, was not just a political assassination. It was part of a much larger game, a game of power, control, and manipulation. These powerful figures, be they from the CIA, the mafia, or a group of faceless elites, had one thing in common. They feared Kennedy's vision for the future. The combination of his foreign policies, his progressive domestic ideals, and his unwillingness to play by the rules of the power elite made him a target. He was too dangerous, they believed, for the status quo. But even as these revelations began to surface, the public remained in the dark. The media, controlled by powerful interests, continued to perpetuate the myth of Oswald as the lone gunman, ignoring the contradictions in the evidence. But for those with the courage to ask the right questions, it became clear that the assassination had been a carefully orchestrated plot. From the meticulous planning to the careful silencing of witnesses, everything pointed to an effort far beyond Oswald's alleged lone actions. Then, the discovery of an old, declassified memo from the CIA's internal archives caused a stir. The document, written in a cryptic code, hinted at a plan that had been set in motion years before Kennedy's death. It spoke of removing obstacles and referenced several key figures, some who had been identified and others whose names had been blacked out. It was clear that Kennedy had been seen as an obstacle to a long-standing plan, one that transcended party lines and national borders. For decades, the public had been fed a story of a lone assassin, a man who in a single moment changed the course of history. But the real story, as it began to emerge, was one of power, manipulation, and dark forces working behind the scenes. Abraham Lincoln's assassination followed a similar pattern. Booth's name would forever be associated with the death of the 16th president, but the true masterminds, the ones who orchestrated the plot, remained hidden in the shadows. In the years after Lincoln's death, a quiet investigation was launched into the role of various factions who may have been involved in the conspiracy. But the truth was buried under layers of lies and half-truths. Booth was presented as the sole assassin, a man driven by personal motives, his allegiance to the South, his desire to avenge the Confederacy. Yet the deeper one dug into the political climate of the time, the clearer it became that Lincoln's assassination was not an isolated act of revenge. It was rather the culmination of a larger struggle for power. Booth, though a key figure in the assassination, had his own backers, powerful men who sought to protect their interests in the South, who feared Lincoln's plans for post-war Reconstruction would undo everything they had worked for. Booth was a symbol of the larger forces at play, a man who had been manipulated into carrying out a plan that was not his own. And the consequences of his actions reached far beyond the tragedy of Lincoln's death. There were whispers of secret meetings, shadowy figures in the background, and hidden agendas that reached all the way to the halls of power. These were not men seeking justice for the South. They were men determined to protect their wealth, their land, and their influence. They had seen Lincoln as a threat to everything they held dear, and his death was necessary for them to maintain control. The secrecy surrounding Garfield's assassination was equally unsettling. Guiteau's involvement in the death of the 20th president seemed almost too convenient. A madman with a gun, firing on a president whose administration had barely begun. But as the investigation unfolded, it became evident that Garfield's death was not the result of a single shot fired by a deranged individual. It was part of a larger conspiracy, a quiet but determined effort to remove Garfield from office and maintain the grip of the political elite on the country's leadership. Guiteau, though seemingly unhinged, was not acting alone. Documents recovered from various sources painted a picture of a group of men who had long worked behind the scenes, pulling the strings of political influence. They feared Garfield's reformist agenda, his commitment to civil service reform, and his ability to disrupt the status quo. For them, Garfield's presidency represented a threat to their power, one that could not be allowed to continue. The details of the conspiracy grew darker still when it was revealed that Garfield's death had been prolonged not just by the bullet, but by the medical incompetence of the doctors tasked with treating him. Some even wondered if the president had been subjected to unnecessary surgeries, all under the watchful eyes of those who wished for him to die slowly, to become a martyr for the political cause. In the end, the truth about Garfield's death, like Kennedy's and Lincoln's, was obscured by a cloud of lies and manipulation. The real story behind these tragic events was hidden from the public for generations, concealed by those who sought to maintain their hold on power. These were not simple assassinations. They were orchestrated moves in a larger game, one in which power, control, and influence were the ultimate prizes. And as the years went by, the whispers of the conspiracy grew louder. New documents were uncovered, old files were re-examined, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. What had once been dismissed as mere speculation began to look more like the truth. The American public had been kept in the dark for too long. The truth about these assassinations, these political murders, was out there, buried in the archives of history. But those who sought it were often met with resistance, both from those who feared the truth and from those who had spent years ensuring that it would never see the light of day. The shocking truth behind the assassinations, secrets of the 3 U.S. presidents never before revealed. It was a crisp autumn evening in Washington, D.C., when a retired CIA agent sat down in a dimly lit room, his hands shaking as he reached for the manila envelope before him. It had taken years of careful maneuvering, secret meetings, and coded messages to finally access the files contained within this envelope. A collection of documents, photographs, and recordings that, if revealed to the public, would shake the foundations of American history. What lay inside was not just a retelling of well-known events, but the hidden truths about the assassinations of 3 of the most iconic presidents in the nation's history: John F. Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, and James A. Garfield. These men, whose lives were tragically cut short by assassins' bullets, were mere pawns in a much darker, more intricate game, a game of power, influence, and conspiracy that the American public had never been privy to. For decades, we've been fed the stories of lone gunmen, political dissent, and personal vendettas. We've been told that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in Dallas, that John Wilkes Booth sought revenge for the Confederacy, and that Charles Guiteau's madness was the sole reason for Garfield's death. But what if these stories, so conveniently neat, were nothing more than a smokescreen? What if the real story was far more sinister, hidden in plain sight by those who had the power to bury it? There were whispers in the corridors of Washington, rumors that hinted at a much more elaborate conspiracy, a shadowy cabal of political elites, mafia bosses, and secretive organizations who saw these presidents as obstacles to their own agendas. What if behind the curtains, powerful figures had orchestrated these deaths, knowing full well that the lives of these men were the only price to pay for securing their control over the nation. The truth, as it turns out, was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The documents, long suppressed, reveal shocking details of covert meetings, coded messages, and elaborate plans that had been set in motion long before the fatal shots were fired. These were not just assassinations, they were executions, carefully planned, meticulously carried out, and most importantly, hidden from the public eye. In the weeks before Kennedy's death, rumors of his increasing isolation within the White House had spread. His bold plans to challenge the CIA's influence and his willingness to confront the military-industrial complex had made him enemies whose power extended far beyond the government. And when the bullet struck him in Dealey Plaza, it wasn't just Oswald's actions that sealed his fate. It was the silent, invisible hands of those who stood to lose everything should Kennedy succeed in his vision for the world. But Kennedy wasn't the first president to fall. Just as the country was still reeling from Lincoln's tragic assassination, a hidden war of ideologies was brewing, one that would ultimately lead to the rise of a new power structure in America. Lincoln's vision of unity, of healing the wounds of the Civil War, was a threat to those who had built their wealth and influence on division and conflict. He was a man too dangerous to be allowed to live. And so, just as with Kennedy, a secretive group set to work. And then there was Garfield, whose death was not the result of a single gunshot, but rather a prolonged, agonizing process, carefully orchestrated by men who feared his reformist ideas. Garfield's death was not merely the action of a madman named Guiteau. It was part of a much larger scheme to keep the old political order in power. For those who had fought to keep things the way they were, Garfield's rise represented a dangerous shift, a shift they could not allow. As the CIA agent sat back, his eyes scanning the damning evidence before him, the truth began to unravel in a way that no one had dared imagine. These were not just random acts of violence. They were deliberate, calculated, and executed by those who understood that controlling the nation's leaders was the key to controlling the nation itself. But there was something else, something even more shocking, that no one had ever dared to explore. A hidden thread connecting these deaths in a way that no one had ever considered. The orchestrators,